That's what I find really odd about it. Yeah, it's not just the insistence that autonomy is central to being able to do your duty, is that you can only be autonomous through doing your duty.
Yes.
Right? Which I think is really unusual. And I have to say, I do think that Kant is cognizant of this meta-ethical problem, right? But the ways that he solved it aren't particularly satisfying to a lot of contemporary philosophers, because you really see him try to work out why you should do your duty, what can motivate you to do your duty, in the Critique of Practical Reason. And Nietzsche satirized this, I think, very effectively, because in the Critique of Pure Reason, he kind of banishes God, the immortality of the soul, and all that other stuff to the ether and says, we can know nothing about it. But now in the Critique of Practical Reason, they all come back, not just in cameo, but in starring roles. And he says, well, but as moral postulates, we can bring these back because it's necessary for us to be motivated to do our duty in the hope that this will cash itself out in some way in the end, right? Now, whatever you think about that, there's a lot of theologians I know who tend to like this. I think if you're a modern secular philosopher, you're going to be like,
Yeah. So just to back up a little bit, to make sure people get how these ideas related to each other. So Kant has this idea. So autonomy is when you're acting on ends you give yourself. Heteronomy is when you're acting from ends that come out from outside of you. Okay, sounds reasonable. Somehow, though, acting autonomously means that you're following these very rigid, universal moral rules, and not coming to any other conclusion, which sounds crazy. I mean, if anything, like with the a more natural way to cash out the initial intuitive explanation would be like the opposite, right? That if you're, that if you're acting, morally, right, surely that's heteronomous. It's this thing that's outside of you. It's that super ego society thing. That there's some sort of like Nietzschean, Aleister Crowley, do what you will thing that that would be more like acting autonomously.
Yeah.
But what I think is interesting to see, and I mean, I could definitely, like, looked at in the right angle, held up to the right light at the right angle, I could definitely have that reaction to it, that it feels a little bit like the, one of the slogans of the party in 1984, right? That say that, that freedom is acting on, the categorical imperative. But it is interesting to look at how it gets there, which is that you have, because I think there's like a core of the idea that sounds a lot more intuitively plausible than maybe where he ends up with it, which is to say, like, you start to think about the kinds of things that he would think of as acting heteronomously. So certainly, if you're like Michael Sandel, who I'm not a fan of the one book I read by him, but but he does have some good lectures on this stuff that you can find on YouTube, and he has a nice example about the old Sprite ad that says "Obey your thirst," as like a nice obvious demonstration of the Kantian idea there. That you're being pulled around by these impulses that you certainly don't decide on, hunger, thirst, lust, whatever, that's acting heteronomously. And maybe even like a little less obvious, but I think there's a way to put this that makes it sound plausible. If you're being guided even by like sort of the values that you happen to be culturally indoctrinated in, that's acting heteronomously. That it's this thing that comes from outside of yourself, and so what is it that counts as coming from inside yourself in a way that matters? And Kant would say reasoning, and again I think there's a like way to think about that doesn't sound that sounds sort of plausible. I mean, like some of the most sophisticated contemporary accounts of free will, like John Martin Fisher, say, like, really emphasize the idea that the kind of control over our actions that we should maybe care most about or do care most about, the kind that seems most obviously relevant to moral responsibility, has to do with the idea, our ability to weigh reasons for and against course of action rather than just act on impulse. That like we think of like free will or self-control as something that separates us from other kinds of animals, and that seems to be most plausibly what that is. But then the tricky part is that it's not just weighing reasons or acting on reasons. It's that the only thing that can count as like as pure reasoning, is acting on pure practical reason, is if you are like, basically, he thinks that even though you're only acting freely, and if it's on the basis of law you give yourself, that if you think about it carefully enough, the only law you can give yourself is the categorical imperative. And if you come to any other conclusion, it's like getting the wrong answer to a math problem. So, if you're just using your reasoning and nothing else, you'll get the right answer. And if you got the wrong answer, it must be something other than your reasoning pulling you astray. And so in a way that sort of makes sense on its own terms, even though the idea that like the categorical imperative is just something that's like just pops out of like, reason, like Athena out of the head of Zeus, that it just doesn't really, like, the more you think about that, like I would argue the less sense that makes. It's like, no, it's not, it's not actually inconsistent, right? Not to only act on, on a law that could be the, on a maxim that could be the basis of a universal law. I mean, if you're already committed to that principle, right, then maybe it's inconsistent. But like, I've never really seen where pure consistency is supposed to get you that principle.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be of the school of thought that, there's a deep elective affinity between all elements of Kantian thought, even if they don't necessarily systematically cohere. And in my kind of experience, the people who tend to be inspired by Kant tend to break Kantian morality, tend to break into kind of two schools. One is a school of thought you can associate with people like George Kateb, right, where they're arch individualists and they tend to stress the importance of autonomy. And they tend to gravitate towards the second formulation of the Kantian categorical imperative for that reason, right? And I should say that I include myself in that group, right? The other category of people tend to be much more focused on this notion of rules as the basis for moral behavior. And you see people like Strawson or Parfit kind of gravitate towards this approach, right? That morality should take the form of rules of some sort, right? They never really agree with him about what those should be, but they tend to,
Sorry, I think I got the first one, but give me the first one again.
The first kind of group of Kantian-inspired theorists, I should say, tend to focus on his individualism and his emphasis on autonomy. And consequently, they tend to like the second formulation of the categorical imperative and kind of foreground it more than the first one, right? This emphasis on always treat human beings never merely as a means, but always as an ends in themselves, right? Since that's pretty centrally associated with autonomy. And the kind of connection I would draw between the two, qua Ben, is that there is an elective affinity between these two ideas in the sense that Kant does seem to suggest that there's something really noxious about being good, either because you feel compelled to because of social pressures or because you're being coerced into doing so, by state institutions or whatever, right? And he says, if you think about this, if I hold a gun to your head and I tell you, go help the poor, there's something about this that seems to likes to vulgarize or take away the moral worth of that act, right? And I think, that's intuitively plausible.
Totally.
So he says, to a certain extent, if we want people to be good, or even in the Aristotelian sense, to act virtuously, it has to be something that they choose to do for themselves. Otherwise, it's polluted in this sense, which is also a term Sandel uses.
This has been a free public preview of a patron-exclusive episode of Give Them an Argument. To get the rest of this episode and every other patron-exclusive episode, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis.